boy had not spoken in 4 years. That was the first thing anyone told Nina Graves when she arrived at the Osei-Bonsu estate on a Tuesday morning, with 2 small bags and a heart still bruised from her last job. The second thing they told her was to stay away from the East Wing. The third thing, and this one came in a whisper, from a kitchen girl who could not have been more than 17, was that the last 6 companions had all run, not walked out, ran. One of them had left her shoes behind. Nina nodded at each piece of information as though she was being told where to find the linen closet. She had survived harder things than a quiet child. She told herself that as she followed the housekeeper, a straight-backed woman named Grace Ibarra, down a corridor lined with dark wood paneling and tall windows that let in too little light. "You will not attempt to force conversation," Grace said without looking back. "You will not attempt physical contact unless he initiates. You will not raise your voice. You will not bring electronic devices into his space. You will not sing or hum or whistle within his hearing." Nina stopped walking. Grace did not notice for 3 steps. Then she turned. "Is something wrong?" "You said no singing." "That is correct." "Why?" Grace looked at her the way a schoolteacher looks at a child who has asked why the sky is blue when there is a multiplication table to finish. "Because it upsets him. He becomes distressed. The last companion who hummed without thinking caused an episode that lasted 90 minutes. She paused. "Do you have a problem following that instruction?" Nina thought about it honestly. She had been humming since she was 2 years old. Her mother used to say Nina came out of the womb already mid-song. Asking Nina not to hum was like asking a kettle not to whistle. But she needed this job. She had needed it for 3 months, and this was the first offer that had come. And she was 26 years old and sleeping on her cousin's sofa. And her cousin's sofa smelled like something had died on it, and then thought better of it. "No problem," she said. Grace held her gaze for 1 second longer than was comfortable. Then she turned and kept walking. The boy's name was Emeka Osei-Bonsu, and he was 7 years old, and his father was the kind of man that other men spoke about in careful voices. Kofi Osei-Bonsu had built something, a business empire, a reputation, a presence in 3 countries, that operated on the same principle as gravity. You did not question it. You simply felt its weight and adjusted your life accordingly. Nina had heard his name before she ever heard his son's. Everyone had. You could not read a financial paper or watch an evening news program in this city without encountering that name attached to something powerful. She had formed a picture of him in her mind before she arrived. Broad, hard-faced, the kind of man whose suits cost more than her rent, who walked into rooms and made other people rearrange themselves. She had not formed any picture of his son, because no one ever spoke of his son. That silence, she was learning, was its own kind of information. Grace stopped outside a closed door at the far end of the East Wing. There was nothing special about the door. It was the same dark wood as everything else, but the air around it felt different somehow, quieter, more careful. The way air feels around something that has been hurt. "He will be inside," Grace said. "He is always inside by this hour. You will knock twice, wait, and if there is no response, you will enter slowly and place yourself near the window. Do not approach him. Do not speak first. Do not make sudden movements." She turned to look at Nina fully. "You will have 1 hour. I will come for you. And if he doesn't want me there? Then you will sit quietly and wait out the hour anyway. Your presence is not optional. His father has been very clear about that." Nina looked at the door. Does his father visit him? Something shifted in Grace's face. It was not quite pain. It was more like the place where pain used to be before a person learned to paper over it with professionalism. "Mr. Osei-Bonsu is a very busy man," she said. That was not an answer. Nina did not say so. Grace left. Nina stood alone in the corridor and looked at the closed door and took a breath that she did not entirely feel she had finished taking before she raised her hand and knocked twice, as instructed. Light. Even. 2 small sounds in a big silence. Nothing. She waited 5 seconds. Then she pressed the handle down and eased the door open. The room was large and mostly empty in the way that expensive rooms sometimes are. Not because no one had put anything in it, but because whoever furnished it had been trying to provide space rather than comfort. There was a bed against one wall, neatly made. There was a bookshelf with books arranged by height rather than title, which told Nina that someone else had arranged them, not the child who lived here. There was a low table in the center of the room with nothing on it. There was a window seat along the far wall, wide enough to lie down on, and that was where Emeka Osei-Bonsu was. He was sitting with his back against the wall and his knees pulled to his chest, wearing gray trousers and a white shirt that was slightly too large for him, as though he had been dressed in something meant for a slightly bigger version of himself. His eyes were fixed on the middle distance. Not the window, not the door, not Nina. The middle distance, which is a place that only exists for people who have found a way to go somewhere else while remaining in their body. He was rocking, not dramatically, just a small, rhythmic forward and back, like water moving in a shallow bowl. Nina stood near the door as instructed and looked at him, and felt something shift very quietly in her chest, not pity. She had been told enough about him that she had been braced for pity, and she did not like the weight of it, and she was relieved not to find it. What she felt instead was something more like recognition. She did not examine that feeling closely. She just let it sit there while she moved toward the window, carefully, in the way that you move in a room with a sleeping animal, not because you are afraid of it but because you respect that it has chosen rest. She sat down on the floor beside the window, not on the window seat, not on the chair by the table, on the floor, with her back against the wall below the window, where the afternoon light came in at a low angle and made the dust on the wooden boards look like gold. Emeka did not look at her. She did not speak. For the first 15 minutes, nothing happened. Outside, somewhere far below, a vehicle moved along the drive. A bird found something interesting on the lawn. The house breathed its large, expensive breaths. Inside the room, Emeka rocked, and Nina sat, and the silence between them was not comfortable exactly, but it was not threatening either. It was just silence, which is not nothing, even when it feels like it. Nina was good at silence. She had learned it the hard way, in waiting rooms and hospital corridors and in the year after her mother died, when silence was the only thing the house offered, and she had learned to stop fighting it. Silence was not empty. It was full of things that had not yet found their shape. At 20 minutes, Emeka's rocking slowed very slightly. At 30 minutes, he shifted. Just a small shift. His weight moved from his heels to the flat of his feet. His arms loosened around his knees. Nothing dramatic, nothing worth recording. Except that it was. Because change, in a room that had not known much of it, is always worth noticing, even if you do not let on that you have noticed. Nina watched the wall. She did not look at him directly. She had learned long ago that direct looking can feel like pressure. Some people need to be looked at sideways, the way you look at something bright. At 40 minutes, Emeka made a sound. It was quiet. It was not a word. It was the shape of something, a low, wandering string of notes without a beginning or end. More like breathing with intention than singing. It rose and fell and turned back on itself. It had a pattern that kept almost repeating but never quite did, the way some music sounds like it is about to resolve and then decides not to. Nina felt the hair on her arms stand up. She did not move. She did not react. She sat very still and listened to this child make a sound that had no name and no audience and was being made for no reason other than that it was in him and needed somewhere to go. It lasted perhaps 2 minutes, then it stopped. The silence after it was different, lighter, as though the room had been holding something heavy for a long time and had just, very quietly, set it down. Grace came at the end of the hour as promised. Nina rose from the floor, moved back to the door, and stepped out into the corridor. Emeka did not look up as she left. She had not expected him to. "How did it go?" Grace asked. Her voice was careful, the voice of someone who had learned not to expect good news but had not yet stopped hoping for it. "Fine," Nina said. Grace's eyes moved over her face, looking for information. He did not become distressed? No. He did not need to be restrained? Because the last companion, no, Nina said again. She paused. He made a sound. Music, kind of. Does he do that often? Grace was very still for a moment. He used to, she said, before. Nina waited, but Grace did not explain what before meant, and Nina had the sense that before was a door that Grace had decided not to open in this particular corridor, at this particular hour, to this particular woman who had only just arrived, and might still be gone by Friday like all the others. "Same time tomorrow," Grace said, and turned and walked away. Nina stood in the corridor and listened to the silence that was not quite silent and thought about a boy with 2 large clothes, and a sound like music that went nowhere and came from somewhere she could not name. She had told herself she would not hum. She had not promised herself she would not listen. She went back to her room that evening and sat on the edge of the narrow bed assigned to her in the staff quarters, and ate a sandwich she had picked up from the kitchen, and thought about Emeka Bonsu. Not about what was wrong with him. She had read the file Grace had provided, the medical language and the behavioral reports and the list of what he could not do. She had read all of that and set it aside. She thought about what he could do, which was, make something that sounded like music out of silence and stillness, and 40 minutes of a stranger sitting near him without wanting anything. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, quite a lot. Downstairs, somewhere in the deep interior of the house, A door closed. She did not know whose door it was. She did not know who walked these corridors at night, or what they were looking for, or whether they found it. She finished her sandwich. She lay down on the bed. She looked at the ceiling and thought about the rules she had been given, and how most of them made sense, and one of them, the no singing rule, sat in her chest like a stone she was not sure she could carry for very long. She closed her eyes. She did not hum, but her fingers, without her permission, began to tap a rhythm on the bedsheet, small and quiet and patient, like something waiting to be let out. Outside, the estate settled into night. The old walls held their breath. And somewhere at the end of the east wing, a 7-year-old boy sat in the dark in a room that was too clean and too quiet and too full of space, rocking in the way that people rock when rocking is the only language they have left, making no sound now, no music, nothing at all. Except, and this part would not go into any report, and Grace would not mention it, and no one would think to write it down, except that his rocking, which was normally as regular and mechanical as a clock, had changed its rhythm slightly. Just slightly. The forward movement was a little longer now. The pause at the top was new, as though something had entered the room with him today and changed the tempo, as though he had, without meaning to, begun to keep time with something that was no longer there. Nina did not sleep well on her first night at the Ose Bonsu estate. The bed was fine, better than her cousin's sofa, better than the camping mattress she had used for 2 weeks before that, but the house made sounds she had not yet learned to identify. Old buildings have their own language, pipes that contract in the cool of night, floorboards that speak to no one in particular, windows that rattle at a frequency that means nothing except that the wind has found a small gap somewhere and is pushing through it. She lay awake for an hour, listening to the house and thinking about the boy. She thought about his file. She had read it twice, once quickly, the way you read something when you are pretending to be professional, and once slowly, with a cup of tea gone cold on the table beside her. The file said that Emeka had spoken his last word at age 3, following a period of distress connected to the death of his mother. The file said that he had been assessed multiple times. The file used words like selective mutism and sensory processing and complex grief, which were words that had truth in them but which, laid out on paper in a clinical font, stripped the truth of its weight. The file said nothing about the sound he made, the music that went nowhere. Nina thought about that sound. She had heard things like it before, not from children, but from her mother, in the last weeks, when language had started to slip away from her, and what remained was not words but something underneath words. A humming, a rocking quality in the voice, as though the body, when it can no longer manage sentences, returns to something older and more fundamental: rhythm, repetition, the comfort of a pattern that does not require you to explain yourself. She had not expected to hear that here. She had not expected to feel, in the 45 minutes she sat on the floor of that boy's room, something that felt less like a job and more like a reunion with a language she thought she had left behind. She got up at 5:30 in the morning and did not bother trying to sleep again. She went to the kitchen, which was large and smelled of old wood and something sweet, and she made herself tea and stood at the window and watched the grounds go from dark to gray to the pale gold of an early morning that had not yet decided how good it was going to be. There were gardens. She had not seen them the day before because Grace had brought her in through the side entrance, past the garages, through a service door, but from the kitchen window she could see a lawn that went on for a long time and then gave way to something more formal, hedges cut into shapes, flower beds that had been planned and tended and taken seriously. It was the kind of garden that said money, but also said time. Someone had spent years here, caring about this. She wondered if Emeka ever went out there. She would ask Grace. She made a mental note. The kitchen began to fill by 6. A cook arrived and began a process involving eggs and a determination that impressed Nina. 2 younger staff members came in and began preparing for something that clearly happened every morning. Nobody spoke to Nina directly, but they were not unfriendly. They moved around her with the comfortable ease of people who know that new staff arrive and most of them leave and the kitchen goes on regardless. At 7, Grace appeared in the doorway like she had been assembled there by someone who needed a doorway to look authoritative. "You are up early," she said. "I am always up early," Nina said. "Good." Grace walked to the kettle and poured herself a cup as though she had approved of Nina and was now moving on. "Emeka will be ready for your session at 10. He eats breakfast at 8. He does not eat with the household. His meals are brought to his room. Does he eat well? He eats what he eats. Some days more, some days less." Grace wrapped both hands around her cup. "Do not interpret his eating as a measure of how the session went. They are not related. Does he have foods he likes?" Grace paused. It was a small pause, barely perceptible, but Nina caught it. He used to like rice with a particular sauce his mother made. The cook has tried to replicate it 3 or 4 times. She stopped. He has not indicated whether the replications are acceptable. Nina absorbed that. What was his mother like? The pause this time was longer. She was warm, Grace said finally. She was the kind of person who knew what a room needed before the room knew it needed anything. She set her cup down and straightened. That is not relevant to your work here. Everything is relevant, Nina said. Grace looked at her for a long moment. 10 o'clock, she said, and left. Nina went back to her tea and her window and her thoughts. Outside, a groundskeeper had appeared on the lawn, moving steadily with a tool Nina could not identify from this distance. The morning had made up its mind now. It was going to be good. The sky was the pale clear blue of something that has not yet been asked to bear any weight. At 9:30, she went back to her room and sat on the edge of the bed, and did something she did every morning. She spent 15 minutes being very still. Not meditating exactly, not praying exactly, just being still, because she had learned that the day goes better when you have given yourself a moment of stillness before it begins. Her mother had taught her that, not in words, just by doing it herself, every morning, in the chair by the kitchen window, before the demands of the day came and claimed her. At 9:55 she walked to the east wing. The door was closed. She knocked twice, waited, entered slowly. Emeka was in the same position as the day before, on the window seat, knees to his chest, facing the room rather than the window. He was wearing different clothes but the same expression, which was not exactly an expression at all, more like the absence of one. His eyes moved when she came in. They did not land on her exactly, but they moved in her direction, which she noted without showing that she had noted it. She went to the floor by the window, same spot, same position, back against the wall, legs extended, hands in her lap. She had brought nothing with her. No book, no phone, no object of any kind, just herself. The first 20 minutes were similar to the day before. Silence. The boys' small rhythmic motion, the house doing its house things around them. Nina sat and let the time pass in the way that you let a fire burn, not trying to make it faster or slower, just letting it do what it does. On the 23rd minute, something different happened. Emeka's eyes moved to her, not past her, not around her, to her, and they stayed. Nina did not look back. She kept her gaze on the wall opposite, soft-focused, giving him the experience of being looked at without the pressure of being seen. She knew the difference. He looked at her for perhaps 2 minutes. She could feel it, not unpleasantly, like the warmth of something that is not a fire but has some of the same quality. Then his eyes moved away. He looked at the floor. And then, so quietly that she almost thought she had imagined it, he made the sound again. The music. That was not music. The wandering line of notes that turned back on itself and resolved into nothing and kept going anyway. Nina closed her eyes. She sat with the sound filling the room, and she sat with the thing that was moving in her chest, and she did not move and did not speak and did not, even for a second, let herself hum. But her fingers tapped the floor beside her, just twice, just finding the beat. Emeka's sound paused. She stilled her fingers immediately. Her heart was knocking. Silence. Then, carefully, as though he was testing something, Emeka made the sound again, slightly louder this time, just slightly. Nina did not tap again. She sat absolutely still and let the sound wash over her, and told herself that this was progress, and progress was not supposed to feel like grief, and yet here it was, doing exactly that, sitting in her chest like a stone that was also, in some way she could not explain, a door. The session ended at 11. Grace appeared at the door and Nina rose and walked out. In the corridor, Grace studied her face with the expression of a scientist observing an experiment. He made the sound again, Nina said. Grace's face did something complicated. He has not made that sound in 8 months, she said. He made it yesterday too. I know. Grace was quiet for a moment. The other companions did not mention it. Maybe they did not notice. Maybe, Grace said, in a tone that suggested she did not entirely believe that. They walked back through the house in a silence that was different from the one in Emeka's room, not full of things finding their shape, but full of questions that no one had asked permission to ask yet. At the end of the corridor, Nina stopped. Who decides when he has enough companions, when the arrangement stops? Grace looked at her. His father. And does his father ask Emeka? A pause. His father believes he knows what is best for his son. I am sure he does, Nina said. That is not the same as asking. Grace's expression shifted. Nina could not tell what the shift meant. Somewhere behind it there was something that might have been agreement, and might have been warning, and might have been both at the same time. 10 o'clock tomorrow, Grace said. Nina nodded. She went back to her room. She sat on the edge of the bed. She looked at the wall and thought about a woman named Grace who used the phrase "she was warm," like someone touching a bruise. She thought about a boy who was listening more than anyone had given him credit for. She thought about the sound, the wandering, patient, self-contained music of a child who had run out of words and found something older underneath them. She thought about his father, whom she had not yet seen, and about whom she had formed only the outline of a picture. Big, controlled, powerful, and somewhere behind the control, probably, just like the rest of them, doing the best he could with something he did not know how to hold. She changed into her off-duty clothes and went down to the kitchen and made herself a cup of tea and stood at the window again and watched the groundskeeper cross the lawn with his tool, whatever it was. She had not hummed once today. She had not promised herself she would not tap. But she had stilled her fingers the moment he paused, and she thought about that, the speed of the stilling, the instinct of it. The way her body had known before her mind did that here was something delicate, and here was the exact spot where you either earn trust or break it, and you do not get a second chance. The tea was hot. She held it with both hands. Outside, the light was going golden and long. The day had kept its early promise. Somewhere in the East Wing, she thought, there is a boy who made music twice today. That was not nothing. That was, maybe, everything. The third day was the day of the floor. Nina had not planned it. She had not thought it through the way she thought through most things, with the methodical patience of someone who had learned that plans are how you protect yourself from your own impulses. She had simply arrived at the East Wing at 9:55, knocked twice, waited, entered, and then taken a wrong turn. Not inside the room. She knew the room by now. She could have walked to her spot by the window with her eyes closed. No, she had taken a wrong turn before she even got there. Grace had sent her through the North Corridor that morning because someone was cleaning the East Passage, and the North Corridor was longer, and it took her past a stretch of the house she had not been through before, past a series of closed doors and a window that looked over a courtyard, and she had slowed down without meaning to. She had heard it from 3 rooms away. Not clearly, not recognizably, just something. A frequency that reached into her, the way that frequencies do when they find the part of you that is tuned to receive them. She stopped walking and stood in the corridor and listened. It was coming from behind the door at the end of this section, not Emeka's door. That was still ahead, around another corner. This door. She stood in the corridor for a long moment. She should keep walking. She had 10 minutes and she should not be here, and Grace had not mentioned any rooms in this section. She kept walking. She passed the door. The sound clarified as she did. It was Emeka. She stopped again, just past the door. He was not in his room. He was in here, in this room she did not know, and he was making the sound, the wandering music, but louder than she had heard it before, and with something in it that was different today, more urgent, more, she did not want to use the word distressed, because that was not quite right, more awake, like something that had been asleep and had found its way, somehow, to the surface. She looked at the door. It was slightly ajar. She should not. She looked down the corridor in both directions, empty. She moved to the door and looked through the gap. It was a smaller room than his bedroom, square, plain, with a high window that let in a column of white morning light. There was nothing in it except a low cupboard against one wall, and Emeka himself. He was in the center of the room, on the floor, and he was not rocking. That was the first thing she noticed. He was completely still, sitting cross-legged, and he was making the sound with his eyes open and his face turned up toward the light from the high window. He looked different. In his bedroom he was folded up, compressed into himself, a creature making himself as small as possible. Here he was. She searched for the word and found only this. Here, he was open. Nina stood at the door and watched through the gap and felt the sound move through her, and she did not know what this room was, or why he was in it, and she did not, for approximately 40 seconds, know what she was going to do. Then she moved. She pushed the door open slowly. Emeka's sound stopped. His eyes came down from the window and found the door and found her in the doorway, and she saw something go across his face, not fear, not anger. More like the expression of someone who has been caught being more themselves than they meant to be. "Sorry," she said softly. "I heard you and I didn't know where you were." He looked at her. She looked at him. Then, before she could think herself out of it, she stepped through the door, moved to a spot on the floor about 6 feet from him, and sat down. On the floor, cross-legged, like him, in the column of white light from the high window. He watched her sit. She put her hands on her knees and looked at the wall. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then Emeka turned his face back up toward the window, and he started the sound again. Nina sat very still and breathed slowly, and let the sound fill the room. It moved around them both, bouncing off the plain walls, finding the high corners. It was the same wandering, self-contained line of music she had heard before, but in this room, without the heavy furniture and the careful decoration of his bedroom, it had room to open up. It sounded larger. It sounded like something that had been living in a small space and was relieved to find itself somewhere bigger. She felt the thing in her chest again. The recognition. The grief that was not pity. She sat for a while with that feeling and let it be what it was. And then, she could not stop it. She had not planned it. It simply happened the way that certain things happen when your defenses have been worn down over 3 days of sitting in silence. Her fingers began to tap the floor. Not a random rhythm. A specific one. The same rhythm she had been finding in her sleep. The one her fingers went to when she stopped paying attention. The rhythm that had been underneath Emeka's sound from the beginning. The quiet architecture of it. She tapped it softly. 3 light beats. A pause. 2 light beats. Emeka stopped. She stilled her fingers. Her heart was hammering. Silence. And she waited for him to withdraw, to fold up, to rock away, to do whatever he did when something came too close. She was ready to apologize again, to back away, to accept that she had moved too fast, and would spend the next week rebuilding whatever small thing she had broken. Emeka did not fold up. He looked at her hands. He looked at her face. He looked back at her hands. And then, with the careful deliberateness of someone testing the weight of a bridge before crossing it, he raised one hand and tapped the floor beside him. 3 beats. A pause. 2 beats. Her rhythm. Back at her. Nina's breath left her body in one slow, controlled exhale. She did not let anything show on her face. She did not cry, though the thing in her chest was doing something she would have to examine later, in private, where no one could see it. She waited 2 seconds. Then she tapped the rhythm again. He tapped it back. They sat in the white light of that anonymous room and passed the rhythm between them like something both of them had been carrying for a long time, and were only now, for the first time, able to set into the air where it could be shared. It lasted perhaps 10 minutes. No words. No eye contact sustained for longer than a second. Just the rhythm, back and forth. Emeka's small hand on the floor. Nina's fingers light against the boards. The sound of it the only language in the room. When Grace came looking for her and found her in the wrong room at 11:05, the expression on the housekeeper's face was one that Nina would remember for a long time. It was not anger. It was not surprise. It was the expression of someone watching something they had stopped believing was still possible. "You should not be in this room," Grace said quietly. "I know." This was his mother's room. A pause. "He has not been in here in 4 years. Nina looked at Emeka. He had gone back to looking at the high window. His hand was still on the floor, resting palm down on the spot where he had been tapping. "He brought himself here," Nina said. I followed the sound. Grace was quiet for a long time. Then, slowly, she stepped back from the doorway. "Come for lunch at 1, she said to Nina. And then, very quietly, to no one in particular, to the room, to the 4 years of closed doors and silence that had accumulated in it, "Take your time." She left. Nina sat with Emeka in his mother's room for another 30 minutes. She did not tap again. She did not speak. She sat with her back against the wall in the column of light, and listened to him make his music, and let the morning be what it was, which was ordinary and extraordinary at the same time, which is the only way that the most important mornings ever are. When they left the room, she went first. He followed at a distance of about 4 feet, which was itself a kind of miracle. She noticed something she had not noticed on the way in. Outside the door, in the corridor, a pair of shoes. Men's shoes. Large, well-made, expensive. She looked at them. She looked up and down the corridor. No one. She went on to lunch. But she thought about those shoes for the rest of the day. How long they had been in the corridor. Whether the man they belonged to had also heard the sound from 3 rooms away. Whether the man they belonged to had stood in the corridor the way she had stood, stopped, listening, not knowing what to do. Whether he had stood there long enough to hear the rhythm tapped back. She did not ask Grace. She thought she already knew. And knowing, she thought, was one thing. Letting someone know that you knew, that was a different kind of step entirely, and she was not ready to take it yet. And she suspected that the man with the large, well-made, expensive shoes was not ready either, and that this was, for now, all right. Some things needed to be approached from the side, like children who needed to be looked at sideways, like a language you had stopped speaking and were only just beginning to find again. Kofi Osei-Bonsu had not slept properly in 4 years. He had become skilled at the appearance of sleep, at lying in the dark with his eyes closed and his breathing slowed and his body in the configuration that sleep requires. He had become equally skilled at the appearance of everything else. Rest, patience, control, the absolute conviction that he knew what he was doing, and that it was the right thing. These performances had been, for 4 years, the structure that held his life together. He performed them in boardrooms and in the back seats of cars and in rooms full of people who wanted things from him, and in the empty house at night and, if he was being honest with himself, in his own head, where the audience was only himself, and yet the performance continued anyway, because stopping it felt like the beginning of something he could not name, and was not sure he could survive. He had watched the new companion arrive from the window of his study. He did not make a habit of this. He had made a habit of it this week without deciding to. He had been at his desk when Grace walked the woman across the lower courtyard, and he had looked up and watched them, and then looked down again, and done nothing with what he had seen except file it in the part of himself that filed things. She was not what he had expected. The previous companions had all been very clearly suited to the role on paper. Experienced, qualified, soft-spoken, patient. They had all looked the part. They had all left. He had stopped thinking carefully about why they left, because thinking about it led him to the conclusion that they left because Emeka did not want them, and thinking about that led him somewhere he was not ready to go. The new one, Nina, her name was Nina Graves, did not look the part. She was not particularly tall or particularly polished. She looked like someone who had had a complicated few months and was trying not to let it show. Grace had told him she came highly recommended, that her references were excellent, that she had experience with children who were. He had not let Grace finish that sentence. He did not like the clinical language. He had never liked it. It made Emeka sound like a case file, which was accurate and therefore intolerable. He had approved the hire without meeting her. He did not meet the companions. He left that to Grace. He had learned, after the second one left, that meeting them gave him opinions, and opinions made leaving harder, and he could not keep allowing leaving to be hard. He had not intended to hear them on the third day. He had been in the north corridor on his way to a call, walking fast in the way that he always walked, covering distance with the efficiency of a man who had too many places to be, and had never made peace with that. He had been thinking about the call, about the position he would take, the numbers he would hold in his head, the tone he would use that was neither soft enough to be misread as weakness, nor hard enough to close off the negotiation before it began. He had been thinking about all of that when he heard the sound. He had heard it before, of course, 4 years ago, constantly, in the kitchen in the mornings, in the garden, in the car. A child who seemed to carry music inside him the way other children carry a favorite toy. And then not at all. And then, in the last 2 days, faintly through the walls of the East Wing in a way that he had told himself he was imagining. He had not been imagining it. He stopped in the corridor. He was outside a door he had not opened in 4 years. He stood and listened to his son make the sound on the other side of it, and he stood very still, the way that men stand very still when they are in the presence of something that could break them, and are trying to decide whether to stay or go. He stayed. He heard the woman's voice, soft, 2 words, an apology. He heard the door. He heard his son's sound pause and then, after a silence that lasted long enough to make him hold his breath, resume. He stood in the corridor and listened. He heard the tapping. 3 beats. A pause. 2 beats. And then, and this was the thing he would carry with him for the rest of the day and into the night, and through the careful hollow performance of sleep, he heard his son tap it back. He stood in the corridor for 5 more minutes after that. He did not go in. He did not knock. He did not announce himself. He stood very still with his hand flat against the wall, and his eyes closed, and his breath controlled, and underneath all of it, the particular kind of grief that does not announce itself as grief, that wears the costume of something else, relief maybe, or gratitude, or the complicated feeling of watching someone else hold the thing you have not been able to hold yourself. Then he made himself leave. He walked to the call. He was 3 minutes late, which had never happened before, and no one said anything, because no one says anything to Kofi Osei-Bonsu about being 3 minutes late. He sat in his study with the phone against his ear and the numbers in his head, and he said what he needed to say, and he listened to what he needed to hear, and he did not once think about the call. He thought about a rhythm, 3 beats, a pause, 2 beats. He thought about his son's hand, which he had not held in 4 years. He thought about a woman sitting on the floor of his late wife's room, a room he had not been able to open, a room that had stayed closed like a held breath, sitting on the floor in the column of light with her hands on her knees, doing nothing except being present, which was the thing he had not known how to do, the thing that had required a stranger to come and demonstrate. That evening, after the call, after the correspondence, after the meeting that could have been handled by 3 different people but had been scheduled for him because his name was the kind of name that needed to be attached to things, he went back to the north corridor. He stood outside the closed door of his wife's room. He put his hand on the handle. He did not turn it. He stood there for a long time, long enough for the corridor lights to dim slightly in the way they did at 8:30, and then he took his hand off the handle and walked back to his side of the house. In his study, he sat down at his desk and looked at the framed photograph that stood to the left of the computer screen, the photograph that was always there, that he looked at every day, and had trained himself not to really see because really seeing it required something he did not have to spare. He looked at it now. He let himself look. She was laughing. She was always laughing in the photographs, because she had been the kind of person who laughed genuinely, without calculation, without thinking about what she looked like when she did it. She was holding a child who was also laughing, a child with his arms flung out and his head thrown back, a child who, at 2 years old, had already been working out that the world was full of sound, and that sound was the best thing in it. Kofi looked at the photograph for 3 minutes. Then he turned it face down, not because he could not bear it, because, for the first time in a long time, bearing it had required something that was very close to tears, and he was not quite ready for that either. He picked up the phone. He called Grace. "Tell me about today," he said. Grace told him, carefully. She described what she had found: the wrong room, the floor, the 30 minutes. She described Nina's explanation. She described, in a neutral tone that he saw through entirely, what she had seen on Emeka's face when she came to the door. Kofi listened without interrupting. He was very good at listening. People often mistook his silence for evaluation. It was not evaluation. It was the effort of hearing what was being said underneath what was being said. What Grace was saying underneath what she was saying was, "This one is different." What she was also saying, in the careful gaps between her sentences, was, "This is going to cost you something. Staying with this, letting this happen. It is going to open a door you closed for good reason, and you are going to have to stand in the opening of it and not run." When she finished, he thanked her. He put the phone down. He sat at his desk in the quiet of his study and thought about the shoes he had left in the corridor. He had not meant to leave them there. He had simply forgotten to pick them up when he left, because all of his thought had been occupied by other things. And when Grace mentioned this to him now, carefully, neutrally, as though it were a small administrative detail, he had said nothing. He had left his shoes in the corridor of his dead wife's room, while a stranger sat inside it with his son, and they tapped a rhythm between them on the floor. He was not sure what to do with that. He was not sure what to do with any of this. But for the first time in 4 years, he was not sure in a way that felt like the beginning of something, rather than the end. The reassignment happened on a Thursday, and no one asked Nina about it. That was the part that stayed with her. Not the fact of the change. She had half expected something to shift after the room, after Grace's face in the doorway, after the shoes in the corridor that no one had mentioned but that everyone, she suspected, had noticed. She had expected the arrangement to change in some way. What she had not expected was the method of the change, which was a knock on her room door at 8 in the morning from Grace, who stood in the doorway and said, without preamble, "Your duties have been reassigned." Nina looked at her over her tea. "Meaning what?" "Meaning you are no longer assigned to the laundry." Grace held a piece of paper that she had clearly written herself, in a small, precise hand. "You are now assigned to Emeka's care full-time, 7 days a week. Your sessions will be extended to 3 hours, morning and afternoon. You will take meals in the East Wing unless otherwise specified. Your salary has been adjusted." She handed Nina the paper. Nina looked at the number on it. "That is more than I was hired for," she said. "Yes." "Did someone ask Emeka about this?" Grace was quiet for the length of time it takes a person to decide how honest they are going to be. "He will be informed." That is not the same as asking. Grace's face did the thing it had done before, the complicated shift that was part agreement and part warning, and part something she was keeping to herself. "The decision has been made," she said. "Your response is needed by 9. Nina looked at the paper. She looked at the adjusted salary. She thought about her cousin's sofa and the 3 months of waiting, and the way it felt to sit on the floor of an anonymous room in a column of white morning light, while a child tapped a rhythm back at her. She thought about going back. She thought about the specific texture of what going back would feel like, and it felt like the inside of a room that was too small for her now. "I am not responding by 9, she said. Grace blinked. "I beg your pardon? Tell whoever made this decision that I need to speak with Emeka first, that I need to tell him what is changing and give him a chance to say something about it, even if what he says is not words." She She set the paper down on the bed beside her. After that, I will decide. Grace stared at her for a long moment. You understand that no one has made that request before. I understand that, Nina said. Tell them anyway. Grace left. Nina drank her tea and looked at the wall and did not think about what happened next, because thinking about what happened next was the kind of thinking that used up energy she needed for the present moment, and the present moment required that she sit still and be clear about what she was willing to do and what she was not. At 9:15, Grace came back. You can speak to him, she said. There was something in her voice, something carefully placed there, like a word in quotation marks, that told Nina this concession had required a conversation with someone, a short conversation. A conversation from which Grace had returned slightly more composed than before she'd had it. Nina went to the east wing. Emeka was on the window seat, knees up, looking at the room in his sideways way. He registered her arrival the same as always, a small movement of the eyes, then away. She sat down on the floor. She did not go immediately to her usual spot by the window. She sat in the center of the room, closer than usual, which she never did, and waited to see if he would mind. He did not fold up. He did not rock away. She took a breath. Something is changing, she said. About our time together. I am going to be here more. Longer. I am not going to be doing other things in the house anymore. Just spending time with you. She paused. I wanted you to know that before it happened. Not after. Emeka looked at the floor. You do not have to feel any particular way about it, she said. I am not telling you so that you can say thank you. I am telling you because it is your time, and I think you should know what is happening to it. She stopped. She had said what she came to say. She waited. For a long moment, nothing. Then Emeka's eyes came up from the floor. They found her face. Not sideways, not peripheral. Directly. Briefly. 1 second of direct, unguarded looking. Then they went away again. He turned his face toward the window, and he started the sound. Not the small, careful version she usually heard. Not the sound that tried to take up as little space as possible. The full version, the one she had heard in his mother's room. The one that had room inside it, the one that sounded like something that had been waiting for the right container. It filled the room. Nina sat on the floor in the center of the room and listened to it, and let it do to her what it did, which was reach into the part of her that had been carrying something for a long time and, gently, without asking permission, set it down. She did not tap, she did not hum, she just sat. When the sound finally quieted, she rose from the floor, smoothed her clothes, and walked back to her room. She picked up the piece of paper with the adjusted salary. She wrote yes at the bottom of it. She went to Grace's office and slid it under the door. There she went back to the east wing. She knocked twice. She waited. She went in. This time she brought a chair, just a small one from the corridor. A plain wooden thing with no particular character. She set it against the wall by the window, not the window seat, not the floor, a chair. One small step up from the floor. A small recalibration of the space. Emeka watched her set the chair down. He watched her sit in it. His eyes moved across it with the careful attention of someone cataloging change, storing it, deciding what it meant. He went back to looking at the room. After a few minutes, he reached out with one hand and placed it flat on the window seat beside him, palm down, not extended toward her, just flat, on the surface, present. Nina looked at his hand. She looked at the wall. She sat in her chair. She thought about a woman named Grace who had stood in the doorway of a room and said, "Take your time," to no one in particular, and to everyone at the same time. She thought about a man who had stood in a corridor and left his shoes there and walked away, which was a way of saying something without saying it. She thought about the people in this house who were all, in their different ways, trying to figure out how to be present in a situation that did not come with instructions. She thought about herself in this chair that was one step further in than the floor. This chair that was still at a safe distance but that required, from her, something more than the floor had required. The floor was the place where you had nothing to prove. The chair was the place where you were choosing to stay. She was choosing to stay. The afternoon came in through the window in long, slow angles. Dust turned gold and fell through the light and settled and rose again. Emeka sat on the window seat with his hand flat on the cushion and his face turned toward things Nina could not see. She sat in the chair and stayed. Downstairs, somewhere in the deep interior of the house, a door opened. She heard footsteps, not Grace's quick, purposeful walk. These footsteps were slower, more deliberate. The footsteps of someone moving toward something they had not yet decided to arrive at. They stopped somewhere below her. Then they moved again. Then they stopped. She did not go to the door. She did not look out. She sat in her chair and stayed, and that was enough for now. That was the whole of what was needed, and the house held the afternoon and the afternoon held them all, and outside the window the garden was very still and very green and very patient, the way that things are patient when they have been tended, and know that the person who tends them is going to come back. 6 weeks into Nina's time at the Osei Bonsu house, the sessions had changed in ways that no report would have been able to capture. Not because the changes were hard to describe, exactly, but because the changes lived in the space between things, in the pauses and the micro-movements and the textures of silence that shift when two people have been sitting together long enough to know each other without having said anything. Emeka had his own way of marking the passage of their sessions. He had routines now that were oriented toward her presence rather than simply alongside it. He was on the window seat before she arrived. He had, without anyone instructing him to, moved his small arrangement of objects on the window seat cushion, 3 smooth stones and a small wooden piece that might have once been a toy, to the left side, leaving the right side available. Not for her, she would not presume. But the gesture of it was there, the making of room. He still did not speak. He still did not initiate contact. He still kept his eyes mostly away from her face, meeting her gaze in those brief, 1-second openings, and then returning to the middle distance, or the floor, or the window. But the quality of these sessions had changed in the way that a room changes when someone has been living in it long enough to leave traces. Something had settled. Nina had also changed. She had stopped fighting the rules in her own head. She had learned, in the first 2 weeks, exactly how close she could come to humming without technically humming. The held breath, the shaped exhale, the controlled restraint of it. And then, in the 3rd week, she had simply stopped doing that too. She had decided that the restrained version was its own kind of noise, its own kind of pressure, and that Emeka did not need her restraint. He needed her ordinary. So she talked. Not much, not constantly, but quietly, in a low voice, she had begun narrating. Not teaching him, not prompting him, not asking questions, just narrating the way that people narrate things to themselves when they are alone, and doing something ordinary. I am folding this cloth now. It is blue. Blue is a patient color. This corner wants to be crooked, which I am not going to let happen. Here is the fold. Here is the crease. This is what patience looks like when it has been applied to a piece of cloth. He listened. She knew he listened because his sound, the music, had begun to appear in response to particular words. Not all words, not predictably, but sometimes, when she said something that landed in a particular way, the sound would start, not as a response exactly, more as a confirmation, as a yes in the only language available to him. She had learned which words called it up and which did not. Calm words, specific words, words that described things exactly as they were without embellishment, words that did not ask anything of him. She had told Grace about this on the 14th day, matter-of-factly, over tea in the kitchen. Grace had put her cup down and looked at her and said, "He used to talk like that. When he was very small, he would describe everything he was doing. His mother used to say he was narrating his own life." Nina had thought about that for a long time. On the morning of the 42nd day, she arrived to find the door already open, not ajar. Open, wide, as though the room had been waiting to exhale. She stopped in the doorway. Emeka was on the window seat, but he was not in his usual position. He was facing the door, sitting up straight, hands flat on his knees, looking at, not past, not around, looking at the doorway. Looking at her. She stood in the open door and held his gaze for longer than she ever had, maybe 3 seconds, which was, in the currency of their relationship, a very long time. Then she walked in. She sat down in her chair by the window. She put her hands in her lap. She did not say anything. Emeka kept looking at the door for a moment after she sat down, as though checking that the open door was still there. Then he turned to the window. And he made the sound, but different. The sound today was not the wandering line she knew. It had a shape she had not heard before, something more structured, something with a discernible beginning and a movement toward something, though still no ending, still no resolution. It was evolving. The music was evolving. Nina sat in her chair and listened and narrated nothing. There was nothing to narrate. Everything was already being said. She sat for 3 hours that morning, and 2 in the afternoon, and in the space between sessions she walked in the garden for the first time, because Grace had told her it was permitted, and because she had been inside for 6 weeks, and her body was beginning to make quiet complaints about that. The garden was extraordinary. She had seen it from the window, but standing in it was different. The scale of it, the deliberateness of the choices that had been made. Here was where someone had planted things that would take years to be what they were supposed to be. Here was where someone had trusted the future. She walked along a gravel path that ran between hedges she could not see over and found, at the end of it, a bench that faced a bed of something tall and white and very still in the windless afternoon. She sat on the bench. She looked at the tall white flowers. She hummed. Just once. Just the first bar of a thing that had been living in her chest for 6 weeks, waiting for somewhere to go. She let it out into the open air of the garden, and the garden took it without making a fuss, and she sat for a moment with the remains of it on her lips and thought, There it is. Still there. All right. You were told not to hum. The voice came from behind her. She did not startle, which surprised her. She turned. Kofi Ose Bonsu was standing on the gravel path, about 10 feet behind the bench. He was in work clothes, not a suit, but the kind of clothes that people wear when they have come from a suit and changed into what comes after. Dark trousers and a white shirt with the sleeves turned up. He was very still. He was very large in the way that people are large when they have stopped trying to make themselves less so. She had not spoken to him before. She had seen him twice from a distance, once crossing the lower courtyard, once at the far end of a corridor, and had formed impressions. The impressions were correct. He was exactly as self-contained as he looked. His face gave nothing away, but it was the specific kind of giving nothing away that costs something, that is maintained at an ongoing expense. She looked at him steadily. I was told not to hum near Emeka, she said. I am in the garden. He was quiet for a moment. A technicality. An accurate one. Something moved across his face, not quite a smile. The possibility of one. How is he? She thought about the open door. The 3 seconds of eye contact. The music that was growing a structure. He is good, she said. He is doing something I do not have a word for, but it is good. Kofi nodded. He did not move toward the bench. He stood on the gravel with his hands in his pockets and looked at the white flowers. She had the sense of a man who had come somewhere with a purpose and lost it on the way. I hear him more, he said. The sound he makes. It is louder than it used to be. Yes. That is improvement? That is him taking up more space, she said. I think that is the same thing, for him. He was quiet again. Then, what was the sound you were just making? She looked at him. It is something my mother used to sing. I have been carrying it around for a while. And the garden is where you put it. The garden is where I was when it needed to come out, she said. The result was similar. He absorbed that. He looked at the flowers. She looked at the flowers. The afternoon was still and clear, and between them the silence was not uncomfortable, but it was full, the way silences are full when 2 people are each carrying something and have not yet decided whether to set it down. The room, he said, not as a question, not as an accusation, just as a word he was placing in the air, as a test of how it felt to say it. Yes, she said. He had not been in there. I know, Grace told me. Did she tell you why? Nina looked at him. She held his gaze the way she had learned to hold difficult things. Not gripping, just holding. Not in so many words, she said. Kofi took a breath that she could see him take. Deliberate, controlled. The breath of someone managing the inside of themselves with the same discipline they would apply to a board meeting. She was remarkable, he said. In that room she could make a room feel like it had arms. Like it was holding you. He stopped. He did not look at Nina when he said any of this. He looked at the flowers. He used to follow her everywhere, into every room. He would sit on the floor and watch her and make that sound. She would talk while she worked, just narrate what she was doing, and he would listen and add to it with the sound, like a call and response. He stopped again. Nina said nothing. I did not know, he said, that someone else could do that. She thought about being careful here. She thought about the right distance to hold. Then she thought about a boy in an open door and said, He is teaching me his language. I am just trying to be a good student. Kofi turned and looked at her. It was a long look, the kind that is also a question that does not have words yet. Then he nodded once. He looked at the bench as though considering sitting on it and then deciding against it. The way you decide against something when sitting would require you to become more present than you currently have the resources for. Thank you, he said, for the room. For whatever you said to him before the reassignment. She looked at him. Who told you about that? Grace tells me what I need to know, he said. She thought about what Grace had and had not said, and what the distinction between those 2 categories meant in this house. You should talk to him, she said. Even if he does not respond, talk to him the way his mother used to. She paused. Narrate. Just tell him what you are doing, what you see. Small things. Kofi was very still. He is listening to everything, she said. He has always been listening. He just needed to know that it was safe to let you know that. He did not answer. He stood on the gravel path in the afternoon light, and looked like a man standing at the edge of something. Not afraid exactly, but very aware of the size of the step. "Good afternoon," he said, and left. Nina turned back to the white flowers. She sat on the bench for another 10 minutes. Then she went back inside. In the east wing, she knocked twice, waited, and entered. Emeka was on the window seat. The door was still open. She sat in her chair. She said very quietly to the room, "The garden is very still today. The flowers at the end of the gravel path are tall and white, and they do not move, even when you think there is enough wind for moving." Emeka turned from the window. He looked at her face. 1 second, 2, 3. She kept talking. "I sat on a bench and I let out a sound that has been living in me for a while, and the garden did not mind." Emeka's eyes stayed on her face. She stopped talking. He started the sound. The structure was clearer today. She could almost, find the shape of a melody in it. Not a known melody. His own. Built from something inside him that had its own logic, its own beginning that kept beginning, its own not quite ending that kept going. She sat in her chair and listened. Outside, somewhere in the garden, the gravel crunched under someone's feet. Then it stopped. Then it started again, moving in a slow and deliberate direction that she thought might, eventually, lead toward the house. 7 weeks in, and Kofi had been in the North Corridor 5 times. He counted, because counting was a way of tracking something without letting it be what it was. Not a ritual, not a compulsion. Just 5 walks to the end of a corridor at varying hours of the day. He counted the way you count things when you are not ready to call them by their name. On 4 of the 5 occasions he had stopped outside the door of his wife's room and listened. On 3 of those 4, he had heard something. On 1 he had heard Nina's voice, low and continuous, doing the narrating thing that she did, the same thing that Adana had done, that particular quality of presence in words, the room filling not with noise but with company. On the other 2 he had heard Emeka's sound, growing, taking on shape, each time slightly different from the last. On the 5th occasion, a Thursday afternoon, overcast, the house dim in a way that made it feel smaller, he had heard both at once. He had not been ready for that. He had not prepared himself. He had walked to the corridor with the specific intention of getting to the other end of it to check something with the estate manager, and he had been walking at his normal speed, thinking about something entirely different, and he had heard Nina's voice and Emeka's sound layered over each other like 2 instruments that had found the same key, and he had stopped walking and put his hand on the wall. He stood there for 4 minutes. He knew it was 4 minutes because he looked at his watch before he moved and again after. He was not a man who cried. He had not cried since Adana's funeral, and even then only in the car on the way back, alone, with the partition up, for approximately 11 minutes, after which he had composed himself and gone back inside to be what was needed. He did not cry now, but something in his chest performed an action that had the shape of it without the tears, a contraction, a release, a brief and involuntary opening of something he had kept closed. He walked on. That evening he called Grace again. This had become a pattern, the daily report. He had started requesting it in the 2nd week, framed as an administrative matter, routine oversight, the kind of involvement any attentive parent would maintain. Grace reported without embellishment and without commentary, which he appreciated, because her commentary would have had a quality of gentleness he was not prepared for. "He is beginning to seek proximity," Grace said tonight. Meaning what exactly? Meaning he moves closer to her during sessions. He does not make contact, but he reduces the distance. Yesterday, he was approximately 3 feet from her chair. 3 feet. Yes. Kofi absorbed this. 3 feet was a very different number from 6 feet, which was a very different number from the window seat at the far end of the room. 3 feet was the distance of. He did not finish that thought. He moved on. "And Nina," he said. "How is she managing the extended time?" "She does not appear to find it taxing," Grace said. "She appears to find it the opposite." "What is the opposite of taxing?" "I am not sure there is a single word for it," Grace said. "She looks like someone who has found the work they were always supposed to be doing, and is annoyed it took this long to find them." Kofi was quiet for a moment. "She said something to me. In the garden." Grace did not respond. She was giving him room to say it, which he both appreciated and found, in some obscure way, difficult. "She said I should talk to him," he said, "the way Adana used to. Narrate." A pause. "Yes," Grace said. "You agree?" "I have thought so for some time," Grace said. Kofi set this aside. He would examine it later. She also said he is teaching her his language. That is one way to describe it. What is another way? Grace was quiet for what felt like longer than the question required. Then, I think they are building one together, she said. Something new. That belongs to both of them. He sat with that. The study was quiet around him. The photograph was still face down on the desk. He had not turned it back. He thought about turning it back and decided not to yet. Has he asked for her? He said. Has he? I do not know how he would show that, but has he shown something like that? He was at the door this morning when she arrived, Grace said. He had opened it himself. He was waiting. Kofi pressed his lips together. He breathed through his nose. He looked at the face-down photograph. Good, he said. That is good. Yes, Grace said. He thanked her. He ended the call. He sat in his chair and looked at the ceiling of his study, which was very high and very plain, and had never been looked at with as much attention as he was giving it now. He thought about what he was going to say. He thought about standing outside a door and what it would cost to open it. He thought about the narrating, the specific act of it, the sustained presence required, the particular kind of attention that says, I see this room and I see what is in it, and I am here with you in it. He had been in this house for 4 years without being here with anyone. He had managed the house. He had funded Emeka's care. He had hired and accepted the loss of 6 companions without allowing himself to feel the loss as anything other than logistics. He had sat in this study and worked because the work was the place that made sense, because the work required only what he had and not what he was missing. He was missing the thing that Adana had had, and he had always known that he was missing it, and he had assumed, in the way that people assume things that make bearing loss easier, that it was simply not in him, that the warmth was hers and the capability was his, and together they had made a complete thing, and now it was only half, and the half that remained was the half that built rather than held. He was reconsidering. The next morning, a Friday, the sky pale and tentative, he walked to the east wing at 11 o'clock. Not his study, not a corridor, the east wing. He had told Grace he was coming. He had told himself he was only going to look in. He had told himself many things, which was the way he operated, getting himself somewhere by not examining the destination too closely. He knocked on the open door. Nina looked up from the chair. Emeka did not look up immediately. He was turned toward the window, but he registered the knock. His body language changed, a very small tightening. Good morning, Kofi said. He looked at Nina. He looked at Emeka's back. He felt the size of the room and the strangeness of being in it after 4 years of not being in it. Good morning, Nina said. Her voice was level. She was good at level. She looked at him with the specific quality of someone who is not going to direct this, who is going to let him find his own way to wherever he is trying to go. He walked into the room. He stood near the wall on the other side of the window from Nina. He put his hands in his pockets. He looked at the back of his son's head, at the neat line of his collar, at the way he was sitting, the tension that lived in his shoulders, the particular set of them that Kofi recognized because it was his own. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. There is a bird, he said, on the south lawn. I saw it from my window this morning. It is very large, and I do not know what kind it is. It was standing completely still in the middle of the grass, looking at something only it could see. He stopped. Emeka had not moved, but the tension in his shoulders had shifted, not increased, just shifted, like something that has been startled and then chosen to stay. Kofi cleared his throat quietly. I thought it might be important, he said, to tell someone about it. Silence. Then, very softly, Emeka's sound began. Not a response to the words exactly, not a comment on them. But there it was, the sound, starting up in the room as though something had given it permission, as though the air itself had become safe enough. Kofi stood against the wall and listened to his son's music and felt the thing in his chest perform that action again. The contraction, the release, the brief and involuntary opening. He stood very still and let it happen. Across the room, Nina looked at the window. She said nothing. She did not need to. The word came on a Tuesday. Not a word that had been building toward itself. Not a word that arrived with signs and preparation. Not a word that anyone had been expecting that morning when they woke up and went about the beginning of their days. Just a word, small, one syllable. On a Tuesday, in the middle of folding a piece of blue cloth, while Nina talked about nothing in particular. She had been talking about the cloth. She had been saying, this corner wants to be crooked, which I am not going to allow, because cloth is manageable even when other things are not, and this is a thing I know how to fix. She had been pressing the fold with the heel of her hand and thinking about something else, about the garden, about the weather, about the way Emeka had been sitting closer to her chair all week, 3 feet becoming 2.5, 2.5 becoming the width of 2 hands, and she had been thinking about none of this consciously, just holding it in the general background of the afternoon. And then, from 2 feet to her left, from the boy who had not spoken in 4 years, from the child who had built his life inside a language without words and made it enough. Again. One word. Clear. Without inflection. Without the self-consciousness of a person who knows they are doing something significant. Just the word, put into the air, as though it had always been there, and had simply been waiting for the right time to make itself known. Nina's hands stopped on the cloth. She did not turn her head. She did not speak. She waited 3 full seconds, which is a very long time when your heart is hammering, and your eyes are stinging, and everything in you wants to turn and kneel down and hold this child, and tell him that yes, yes, again, anything you want, forever if you need it. She did not do any of that. She started the sentence over. This corner wants to be crooked, which I am not going to allow, because cloth is manageable even when other things are not, and this is a thing I know how to fix. She pressed the fold with the heel of her hand. Emeka made the sound. She folded the cloth. She did not cry. She had decided, in the 3 seconds before she began again, that crying would turn his first word into an event, and an event was not what it was. It was not a performance. It was just him, asking for something, using the only word that was available to him at that moment, which happened to be the word that changed everything. She would cry later. She had already promised herself that. She finished the cloth, she set it aside. She picked up another. This one, she said, is white. White is a complicated color because it looks simple. Emeka did not say again. But he did not say anything else either. He sat in his 2 feet close position and listened, and the sound moved through the room in its patient, structured way, and the afternoon went on, and Nina folded cloth, and the air held everything that had just happened without telling anyone about it. She left at 4. She said her usual quiet goodbye, not to him directly, not requiring a response, just the word placed in the room like a hand on a door. She walked down the corridor and down the stairs and through the kitchen and out the back door, and across the lower yard, and along the fence line, until she got to the place where the fence turned, and there was a gap in the hedge and no one could see her. She sat down on the ground. She cried for 11 minutes, not because she was sad, not because she was relieved, though she was that too. She cried because the word again had done something to the lock on the room inside her where she kept the things she did not say, and things were coming out of it now without permission, and that was all right. That was entirely all right. She just needed somewhere private for it. She sat in the gap in the hedge with her back against the fence and she cried, and she thought about the simplicity of it, about how it was the most human request in the world, to hear something good and ask for it to keep going, to say, that thing. More of that, please. She wiped her face. She straightened up. She looked at the sky, which was doing its ordinary evening things without knowing what had just happened inside a room in the east wing. She went back inside. She went to her room. She washed her face. She sat on the bed. Then she got up and went to find Grace. Grace was in her office, which was a small room off the kitchen with a desk and 2 chairs and a window that looked at the side of a hedge. She looked up when Nina appeared in the doorway. Nina said. He spoke. Grace put her pen down. One word, Nina said. Again. Grace looked at her for a long moment. Her face did something that Nina had not seen it do before. Not the complicated, professional shift that she was used to. Something simpler, something closer to the surface. Again, Grace said quietly, as though tasting the word. Yes. Grace was quiet for a moment. Then she said very carefully, his father should know tonight. Yes, Nina said. She turned and went back to her room. She heard Grace pick up the phone. She did not try to hear the conversation. She lay on her bed and looked at the ceiling, and thought about again, and about the particular weight of a first word after a long silence, how it lands, how it takes up space, how it changes the air. She thought about what Kofi would do with the information. She thought about whether he would come to the East Wing tomorrow and what he would say when he did. She thought about the bird on the south lawn, standing still, looking at something only it could see. She thought about her mother's voice doing the narrating thing over domestic tasks, the food, the laundry, the small work of ordinary days. She thought about how that voice had been the furniture of her childhood, the sound that said, here is where we are, here is what we are doing, here is how present I am with you. She had not known, until she came to this house, that she had been carrying that voice, not imitating it, carrying it, taking it somewhere it needed to go. She fell asleep before dinner, which she never did. She slept without the house waking her. She slept the sleep of someone who has set something heavy down. In the east wing, no lights were on. The corridor was quiet. The door to the mother's room was closed. The door to the boys' room was slightly ajar, as it had been for weeks, not wide open, not shut. Slightly ajar. It was enough. A small light burned in the study. Kofi Osei-Bonsu sat at his desk with both hands flat on the surface and the face-down photograph in front of him, and the word in his mind. Again, sitting there like a coin placed carefully on a table, like a message sent in the simplest possible code. He turned the photograph over. He looked at his wife's face. He looked at his son's face, 2 years old, head thrown back, laughing. He sat with it for a long time. Then he picked up a piece of paper and wrote 4 words on it and folded it and set it on the corner of the desk. He would give it to Grace tomorrow, and Grace would put it where Nina could find it, and what happened after that was not his to manage. The 4 words were, he used to love rice. It was not nothing. It was, maybe, a beginning. The morning after the word, Kofi came to the East Wing and knocked on the door. He had been to the East Wing before, twice, formally, when Grace had needed him to sign something related to Emeka's room, and once the week prior when he had stood at the open door and said what he had said about the bird. That had been an arrival. This was a knock. The difference, in this house, was significant. Nina opened the door because she had heard the knock from her chair, and Emeka had not responded, and so she had risen and done it. She stood in the doorway and looked at Kofi, and he looked at her, and neither of them acknowledged that this was different from the usual order of things. "I would like to sit in for a while," he said, "if that is acceptable." She looked at him. She looked at Emeka, who was on the window seat in his usual position, and had registered the voice with the small shoulder shift that was his version of attention. She looked back at Kofi. "The floor," she said. He paused. "I beg your pardon?" "If you come in, you sit on the floor," she said. "Not on the chair, not on the window seat, on the floor. Away from me, away from him. Just in the room." He looked at her steadily for a moment. She could see him processing this, the request, the logic of it, the indignity of it, and then the settling of something in him that accepted the indignity because he understood the logic. "All right," he said. She stepped back. He came in. He looked around the room. He had not been in it for a long time, and the fact of that was visible on his face for exactly 3 seconds before he controlled it. He moved to the wall opposite the window, not near Nina's chair, not near Emeka's window seat. He looked at the floor. He sat down. He was a large man sitting on a polished floor in the room where his son lived, and it looked exactly as strange as it sounds, and he held it with a stillness that Nina recognized as costing him something. Emeka had not looked at him. He was looking at the window. But the window was not what he was looking at, and Nina knew the difference. She went back to her chair. She picked up the cloth she had been folding, another piece of laundry she had taken to doing in the sessions, a practical thing that gave her hands something to do and her voice something to narrate. "This is a gray cloth," she said, in her ordinary session voice. "Gray is an underrated color. People think it is boring because it is not loud about itself. But gray is not boring. It is just quiet. It is decided that it does not need to announce what it is." She pressed the fold. Silence. Then, from the floor, quietly. "She used to say that about a color." Nina stilled her hands. She did not look at Kofi. She waited. "Adana," he said. His voice was steady, but the steadiness of it was the kind that is built on something that is not steady underneath. "She used to say that about green. She said green is the color that does all the work without asking for credit." He stopped. He looked at the wall. He had not looked at Emeka during this, and Emeka had not looked at him, but in the room something had changed. An arrival of something that had not been there before, settling into the available space. Nina folded the gray cloth. She set it aside. She picked up a white one. "White is more complicated than it looks," she said. "It has everything in it. That is why it looks empty." She pressed the fold. From the window seat, the sound began, low, patient, finding its structure, moving into it. Kofi was very still on the floor. He sat with the sound, and it was clear on his face, the thing happening on his face, the controlled and opened and struggling and gradually quieting thing. It was clear that he had not sat with it before, not like this, not in the same room, in the same moment, hearing it directly rather than through a wall or from a corridor. He listened. Nina folded the white cloth. The 3 of them were in the room together, and the room held them without any trouble, without leaking, without demanding that any of them be more than they were at this exact moment. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. At the 25-minute mark, without warning, Kofi said, "The bird is still there, on the south lawn. I looked again this morning." He paused. It was in a different position. It had moved to the edge of the lawn near the hedge, but it was still standing still. Emeka's sound paused. Kofi stopped. He had not expected the sound to pause, and the pause landed on him visibly. His breath caught, just slightly. Then Emeka's sound began again. Slightly different, still his own, still the wandering, structured thing it always was, but with something new near the beginning of it. A quality of upturn, a questioning quality, as though a sentence had just ended and something in it had been a question. Nina sat in her chair and breathed. Kofi said, to the room, to no one, to the bird that was still on the south lawn, I do not know what it is looking for. The sound continued. At the end of the hour, Kofi rose from the floor. He was not graceful about it. His knees were what they were, and the floor was harder than it looked, and there was a moment of plain physical effort that he did not try to disguise. He stood and straightened. He looked at Emeka's back. Emeka was turned toward the window. I will come back, Kofi said, not to Nina, to the room, to the back of his son's head. He left. Nina sat in the chair and listened to the quiet he had left behind. She thought about the way he had said it, I will come back, like a statement of intent rather than an invitation for a response, not seeking permission, not hedging, just a fact placed in the air. Emeka's sound, which had stopped when Kofi rose from the floor, began again after a minute. She folded the white cloth. White, she said, has everything in it. She let the rest of the morning go on. 2 days later, Kofi came again. Same time, same knock, same question, which was no longer really a question. She opened the door. He came in. He sat on the floor. He brought something this time, a small container, which he set on the floor beside him. When Nina asked, with her eyes rather than her voice, he said quietly, rice. With a sauce I asked the kitchen to try again. He set it near the edge of the room. Emeka did not move toward it. He remained on the window seat, but after a few minutes, Nina noticed his nose, the small, almost imperceptible lifting of it, the attention of a person who has smelled something and is deciding what to do with the recognition. He did not move. But he did not rock away either. He sat facing the window, and the sound he made was different today. Still the same architecture, still the same patient structure, but warmer. Warmer in a way that was not her word for it, but was the only word that fit. Nina sat in her chair. She said nothing. She had learned when to narrate and when to simply be present, and this was the second kind of morning. At the end of the session, Kofi picked up the container. He looked at it. He said, to no one in particular, to the room, the same and not the same. He paused. There are things you cannot replicate exactly, but you can make something that is close enough to be a comfort. He stood. He left. Nina looked at Emeka. Emeka was looking at the door, not the window. The door. For a long moment after Kofi's footsteps had faded down the corridor, Emeka sat looking at the closed door. Then he turned back to the window. He started the sound. This time, Nina let her eyes close. She sat in her chair with her eyes closed and her hands in her lap, and she let the music be what it was. Not a symptom, not a signal, not a data point in any report. Just a boy making the language that was available to him, in a room that had learned how to hold it. Outside, somewhere on the south lawn, a large bird stood completely still, looking at something only it could see. 3 weeks after the word, Emeka said 2 more. Not to Nina, not to Kofi, not to anyone who was prepared for them. He said them to Grace. Grace had not been part of the sessions. She had been the administrator of them, the person who organized and reported and maintained the structure within which the sessions could take place. She had not sat on the floor. She had not narrated. She had appeared in doorways and produced reports, and carried information between people who were too careful with each other to carry it themselves, and she had done all of this with the precision of someone who understood that the mechanism she was maintaining was more fragile than it looked. On a Wednesday morning she came to bring Emeka his breakfast. The kitchen girl had been unwell, and Grace had taken the tray herself, which she occasionally did on the days when it was more efficient than redirecting another member of staff. She knocked twice, as was the custom. She entered slowly. She set the tray on the low table in the center of the room. Emeka was on the window seat. He looked at the tray. He looked at her. Grace said, as she always did, "Good morning, Emeka," and turned to go. "Thank you," he said. Grace stopped. She stood with her hand on the door and her back to the room, and she took one breath, and then another, and then she turned around. Emeka was looking at the tray. "Thank you," he said again. Not to her exactly, not directed, but placed in the room as a thing that was true and needed to be said, the way you say a thing when it is too large to keep inside any longer. Grace said, very carefully, You are welcome. She left. She went to her office. She sat down at her desk. She looked at the wall for 5 minutes. Then she called Nina. Nina arrived at the office to find Grace sitting very straight in her chair, with her hands flat on the desk and her eyes doing something complicated. He spoke to me, Grace said. Nina sat down in the chair opposite. What did he say? Grace told her. Nina sat with that for a moment. He knows, she said. He knows what you have been carrying. He sees more than we think. Grace looked at her. He always did, she said quietly. Even before. He always knew. She paused. Adana used to say he had a gift for knowing what was in a room without being told. She said he collected the feelings of the people around him and held them without knowing what to do with them. She stopped. I think perhaps the not speaking was not about having nothing to say. I think it was about having too much. Nina looked at her. Yes, she said. I think so too. They sat in the small office for a while without speaking, which was its own kind of conversation, and the morning went on outside the window, and the house breathed its large, quiet breaths. Later that day, Nina arrived at the East Wing for the afternoon session to find Kofi already there, not inside. He was in the corridor, standing outside the slightly ajar door, and she knew from his posture that he had heard about the morning. Grace had told him. Of course she had. He looked at Nina when she came down the corridor. He looked like a man who has had something confirmed that he had been afraid to confirm, and who is not quite sure whether confirmation is easier or harder than uncertainty. She stopped beside him. They both looked at the door. Thank you, she said quietly. For coming, for the floor, for the rice. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I do not know how to be what she was. Nina looked at the door. You are not supposed to be, she said. You are supposed to be what you are, and what you are is still something he needs. She paused. He has your shoulders, the way he holds them when something changes. He does exactly what you do. She felt him go very still beside her. He has been watching you, she said, the same way he watches everything. Taking it in, holding it, not knowing what to do with it. But it is in him. She looked at the door. It was always in him. Kofi took a long, steady breath. She stepped forward and knocked twice on the slightly ajar door and pushed it open and went in. From the corridor, after a moment, she heard him follow. Emeka was on the window seat. He heard 2 sets of footsteps and registered them, the small shoulder shift, the tilt of his head. He did not turn. He looked at the window. Nina went to her chair. Kofi went to the floor. The 3 of them were in the room together, and the room held all of it without complaint. After a few minutes, Kofi said to the room, in the narrating voice that had been his for exactly 2 weeks and was still new enough to be careful with, I looked up the bird. The large one on the south lawn. It is a gray heron. They are common in these parts, apparently. They stand still because they are waiting. For fish, for movement in the water, for the right moment. He paused. They are very patient. Emeka's sound began. Nina folded a cloth. The afternoon came in through the window. The heron, somewhere on the south lawn, stood still in the way that herons stand. Completely, without apology, without the performance of patience, just the actual thing itself, waiting for what it knows is coming, in its own time, at its own pace, with the absolute confidence of something that is learned. There is no advantage in hurrying. The corridor at the end of the East Wing looked the same at 7 in the evening, as it did at 7 in the morning. The same dark wood, the same tall windows going dark in the early autumn, the same quality of quiet that was not emptiness but containment, the way certain spaces feel when they have been holding something for a very long time and have gotten good at it. Nina sat on the floor outside Emeka's door. This was not a session. Sessions ended at 4. This was something else. A thing that had happened 3 times in the last week. An evening event that was not in any arrangement, and had not been discussed with Grace, and had no official status at all. She simply came after dinner and sat outside his door and talked, quietly, about nothing important, in the way that people talk through doors when the door is the right amount of distance and the person on the other side is the right amount of present. She talked about the day, about what she had eaten, about a letter she had received from her cousin, who was now seeing someone she had described in approximately 900 words, without once mentioning whether she actually liked him. She talked about the garden, about the heron, about the way the light had changed in the last 2 weeks toward something golden and slanted. She talked about small things, the same things she talked about in the sessions, in the same tone, with the same quality of not requiring anything back. Through the door, she could hear Emeka. Not the sound. He did not make the sound in the evenings. Something quieter. Movement. The soft percussion of a child moving around a room before sleep. The particular sounds of a person existing. She talked and he existed, and the door was the right amount between them. On the fourth evening, she arrived to find the door open, not ajar, open. Emeka was sitting on the floor inside, about 3 feet from the door, with his back to the wall opposite. He was looking at the open doorway. She stopped in the corridor. She sat down, on the floor, on her side of the door. He sat on his side. They were perhaps 4 feet apart with an open door between them. She could see his face clearly in the evening light coming from his window. 7 years old, solemn, watchful, with his father's forehead and his mother's eyes, which Grace had confirmed for her once without being asked. She said, "Good evening." He looked at her. She said, "I had rice for dinner. The kitchen made it with the sauce. It was very good." He looked at his hands. She said, "I think tomorrow I will walk to the far end of the garden. I have not been there yet. I want to see what is past the formal section." He looked at the doorway, at the frame of it, at the threshold between his room and the corridor. She did not push, she simply sat. After perhaps 5 minutes, Emeka moved. He shifted forward on the floor, closing the 4 feet to 3, and then to 2. He stopped 2 feet from the threshold. He was looking at her. Not sideways, not peripheral, not the brief 1-second opening she was used to. He was looking at her face the way a person looks at something they want to understand, with full attention, with the particular quality of looking that is also a kind of listening. She let him look. She looked back, not intensely, not searchingly, just the way you look at someone who is looking at you, which is a kind of permission. For 30 seconds, they looked at each other across 2 feet, and a door, and 4 years of silence, and everything that had grown in that silence, and everything that was, slowly and at its own pace, finding its way out of it. Then Emeka leaned. Not toward her. He did not cross the threshold, but he leaned forward slightly, his weight tipping toward the open door, toward the corridor, toward the evening light. The lean of someone who is, for the first time, interested in what is on the other side of the edge. Nina sat still. She breathed. She said, very quietly, to the open door and the evening and the 2 feet and the 4 years, "I will be here tomorrow too." Emeka looked at her face. He made the sound, just one bar of it, the beginning, the opening, the starting again of the music that had been there all along. Then it stopped. He leaned back against the wall. He looked at his hands. Nina sat in the corridor for another 15 minutes, talking quietly about nothing, and the nothing was full of everything, and the door was open, and the evening went on, and that was all. That was the whole of it. That was enough. Kofi passed the corridor at 7:30. He did not stop. He slowed. Not much. Just enough to take in the sight of Nina on the floor of the corridor, and his son on the floor of his room, and the open door, and the quiet sound of a woman talking about nothing, in a voice that said, "I am here, still here, not going anywhere." He slowed, and he looked, and then he walked on. He went to his study. He sat at his desk. He turned the photograph face up. He looked at it. He looked at it for a long time. Then he picked up the pen and the notepad from his desk and he wrote, in his careful, controlled hand, a list. It was not a list of tasks or numbers or names attached to power. It was a list of ordinary things, things that a boy had liked, once, a long time ago, when everything was different, and a certain kind of life was still possible. Rice with a particular sauce, the sound of someone narrating, the feeling of a floor under him, and a wall behind him, and someone nearby who did not want anything from him except to be there. He looked at the list. He added one more thing to it, at the bottom, after a long pause. A father who is still learning. He folded the paper. He did not know what to do with it yet. He thought maybe he would show it to Nina, or to Grace, or to no one, and it would just be something that existed in the world. A list, folded, sitting on the corner of a desk, the private record of a man who had taken a very long route to a place he should have gotten to sooner and was now, at last, in the vicinity of. He thought about sitting on the floor. He thought about the 3 seconds of eye contact that Nina had described to him a week ago, and how those 3 seconds were longer than anything Emeka had given anyone in 4 years, and how they had cost nothing except presence, which was the thing he had been giving incorrectly, in the form of management instead of company, in the form of provision instead of proximity. He thought about tomorrow morning. He thought about knocking on the door and going in and sitting on the floor and talking about the heron. He thought about doing it not because Grace had suggested it, and not because Nina had told him to, and not because a report had recommended it. He thought about doing it because he wanted to, because the want was there now, had been there all along probably, underneath the management and the provision and the controlled performance of a grief he had not allowed himself to have. Because the thing in his chest that kept contracting and releasing when he heard the sound, when he heard his son's music through the walls or across a corridor or in the same room, was not grief alone. It was something that had survived the grief, something intact, something that wanted back in. He would knock tomorrow. He would sit on the floor. He would tell Emeka about the heron, and about the rice, and about the list on the piece of paper, and about the photograph that he had finally turned face up. He would not explain any of it. He would not make it into a lesson or a revelation. He would just say it, the way you say things to someone who is listening with their whole body even when they are looking at their hands. And Emeka would listen, and the sound would begin, and Nina would fold a cloth or not fold a cloth, and say something about a color. And the corridor would be the same corridor it always was, and the room would be the same room, and the door would be open. And in the evening, without anyone deciding it had become a custom, they would find themselves in their various positions, one on the floor, one in the chair, one on the window seat, one in the doorway, one in the corridor, and the house would hold them, as it had learned to do, as it had been built for, as it was beginning, again, to be. Not the same as before, something new, built from what remained. The photograph stayed face up on the desk. In the east wing, the door at the end of the corridor was slightly ajar in the way it was always ajar now. Not open, not shut, the middle distance, the in-between. Which is where most of the important things live. Which is where, if you are patient enough to sit still long enough and make no sudden movements and ask for nothing except the privilege of being present, the things that have been waiting to be said will eventually find their way out. Not all at once, not dramatically. One word at a time. In a room with a door that had learned how to stay open.